Llewellyn King, the host of CFS Alert. Today I will be talking with Lynn Fuentes, who has vast experience with ME. Her son is afflicted, and she has taught on the subject. She has been part of many of the organizations that have sought a cure, or at least sought to comfort the afflicted. Lynn, welcome to the broadcast, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you for having me here. I am a person who has been a parent of someone with CFS since 1986. My son was 12 years old, and he became very ill. We had no idea what was wrong with him. It took us 7 years. In those days, there was very little to go on. 7 years to get a diagnosis. He's been sick since that time, so it's 37 years now. Most of that time in the severe category, although recently has been doing a little bit better into the moderate to severe, I would say.
When you say severe category, what was the degree of his debility?
Well, always housebound, mostly bedbound, 12 to 15 hours a day, probably in bed the rest of the time, lying on the couch. And then multiple symptoms, as probably everyone listening knows: cognitive symptoms, sleep problems, digestive problems, all of those, all of the time, essentially.
What helped him? Was there anything that he found as a therapy for himself that helped him get through these long, agonizing periods of debility?
Well, it's a great question. And, you'd have to ask him how he's developed his own strength, his own ways of handling it. He's a very, very thoughtful person, spent a lot of time, really, I suppose, in a philosophical thought. And then when he had the opportunity, we would talk about things like that. My role as a caregiver, I myself was not in that situation. So I don't know if I can answer that question well enough for him, only for myself, I guess.
What did you do to support him in this time? Obviously, you provided shelter and food and that sort of thing. Is there any psychological support that you found you could give that helped?
Yeah, I think so. Over the many years, he's had many, many different living arrangements and levels of support from me in one way or another. So there have been, sometimes he lived by himself with help coming in, sometimes lived with us. And I think what I provided more than anything is what I put in my book, that people with illness are following a path that is just as important as anybody else's life path, where they learn just as much. You can be a CEO, you can be an artist, you can be many different things. But having an illness like ME/CFS it's a full-time job. It's also a full-time life path where you encounter challenge after challenge that you have to solve. So people tend to think of it sometimes as a backwater. I think of it as an accelerated course in learning how to be human. That it's a very, very difficult road, and that people with this condition need a great deal more respect than they get for what they do.
Then you mentioned your book, but we haven't discussed your book. Tell us about your book and where people can get it.
It's called the Koan of Chronic Illness. I, about 5 years ago, started teaching courses on integral theory and chronic illness. And integral theory is a philosophy, and it has several models of the way the world works that are very applicable to chronic illness. And they've helped me a great deal sort out a lot of the confusion and difficulties. So I started teaching courses on how to apply this. And over time, I developed a 6-course series that runs around the year. And then I'm getting older, so I thought, well, I better put this in book form because I'm not going to be teaching it forever. So the book is primarily directed to patients, and it offers ways to deal with some of the difficult problems that arise: disempowerment, isolation, relationship changes, and how to see it also as a path for personal growth. So in these courses, we work on our own development and growth and the help one another to deal with these issues. People share information about how they manage all of these different aspects. So
where can people get the book? Is it available on Amazon?
yeah, it's on Amazon. My name, Lynn Fuentes. And it's also goes into the collective. I talk about the great difficulty we have managing our health system. It seems to me that the most fragile people in our culture are handed this almost impossible task of relating to this vast pharmaceutical, hospital, medical system, which is often very, very impersonal, very, very difficult to deal with. In fact, many people I talk to say that's almost the hardest part of the illness, is trying to deal with people who don't understand, who don't have time. The pressures on our healthcare system have been huge, as we all know, and there's almost nobody there who has really the time, the energy, the empathy to sit down with somebody who's dealing with such a complex illness and help them.
Then you talk about growth, human growing as a person. What does that mean? How do we grow? And how do we know if we're growing? And is there and does it have an opposite? Do we sometimes, as it were, shrink?
Well, that's my favorite topic in the world, so I could say a lot about it. But the basic idea of growth, well, we're probably all familiar with Piaget and children. Children have developmental stages. They learn certain concrete things, and then they learn a little bit more abstract things. They grow up, they develop a new way of making meaning about life. A 2-year-old doesn't see life the same way a 16-year-old does. And there's also adult growth. We continue, we don't stop, which makes a lot of sense. We don't stop growing. And anybody probably over 40 can look back and say, well, I'm a lot more mature than I was at 20. I have more understanding of the nuances of things. It's not all just black and white anymore. I have a great deal more experience in relating to the world, and I can understand my worldview. I can understand that, other people have a different worldview, and I can figure out how to relate to this. And so, yes.
Let me tell you something which I think you might find interesting. I've mentioned it from time to time. At the Spanish Riding School in Vienna, the horse place, they say that both the horse and the rider can learn all the days of their lives. And this is their fundamental basic philosophy behind their training of the Lipizzaner stallions who do these amazing things, and the riders who do amazing things. And I love the idea that the horse, I used to be a horseman, and the rider can learn all the days of their lives. I think that's a very good way to approach it. And that's what you mean by growth, isn't it?
It is all the days of our lives. There's always something coming in, and there are different ways to learn. We can broaden our knowledge, but we can also deepen our wisdom. And so when I talk about growth, I often think about it in terms of deepening our wisdom, that we come to know a lot of things, yes, but how do we put that together? How do we have that help us understand the world that we're living in and manage our own lives?
Let's go back to Patrick. And how did he grow in this terrible state of being unable to function as normal children of his age? Did he have friends? Was he terribly lonely? Did he read? Or was he too sensitive to light? Was he able to watch television and movies? Or some people can and some people can't, because their sensitivity to the screen can be very high. How did he get by? How would a day go for Patrick, lying there on your couch, not feeling well and not feeling part of the human race, being under glass, as it were, of the human race, but not participating in its normal activities?
Yes, isolation has been, I'd say, one of the biggest problems, coping with this, just trying to make a meaningful life out of it. Over the years, he's had many different situations. There were times when he couldn't read at all. And that was one of the saddest things, because books have been very important to him. Learning has been very important. He can read now. Television screen still extremely difficult, things that are slow. He can use music, has been a very big part of his life. He's very musically talented and he enjoys music a great deal. So that's been a mainstay. Reading a lot. He's been very much self-educated. He wasn't able to go to school after he was 15 or so, except very briefly. So he's been largely self-educated through reading.
This is very interesting because we interviewed on this program a young lady, I think it was the last program, from England, and she was self-educated. Fortunately for her, she recovered, amazingly recovered, having been very ill for many years, and self-educated because she couldn't go to school, but she could read. She was afflicted, obviously, after she had learned to read, and I assume that was the case for Patrick. And reading is very important to a lot of people with ME. I find, too, in my reporting that sometimes some external thing, there is the famous book now, it's been a book, been out for probably a decade now, about the woman who had a snail. She was so ill she couldn't move, but she could watch the snail and became an expert on the habits and practices of a single snail in a glass container. Other people, I find, cats are very useful because they don't take a lot of care. Cats are pretty self-sufficient. Dogs, not so much so. They need care and walking and all the stuff that dogs need. And pets are very important to people. It's some other life that they can identify with, that they are living in parallel with their pet.
Oh yes, we had cats, and it was wonderful. Actually, taking care of them would have been more than he could have managed, but when they were my cats and he got to see them, yes, that's true. He had hamsters and guinea pigs and things like that over the life. So and I did read that wonderful book. It was Elizabeth Tova Bailey.
That's right. Yeah, Tova Bailey. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I couldn't remember her name offhand. It was a wonderful book. I interviewed her, and she's a very interesting woman. Does Patrick have siblings?
Yes, a sister who has also had some difficulties. When he got ill, she also got ill, recovered, but never entirely. And in recent years, got about 3 or 4 years ago, got mononucleosis and has had a hard time since then. It seems like ME/CFS, a milder version. So yeah, her as well.
That is very tough on a mother, is it not?
It is, because I think, of course, you have great dreams for your children, what they can do, and you see who they are. And I think one of the hardest things is the world doesn't see who they are. You see who they are. You can see their big heart. You can see their brilliant mind, but there's no way to express themselves. And I think that's extremely difficult. The sense that they're not known. They're not seen.
I think at least I've had this feeling that this being hidden in plain sight.
Yes, there is all this talent, all this brilliance, all these amazing people who are almost frozen in place. And I think another aspect of this is they need to make a contribution, and that is so difficult. When you have ME/CFS, there's very little you can do. And so the sense that people don't want to feel like a burden, they want to feel like they're contributing to the world, and they know they have talent. They know they're intelligent. They know many things. And in fact, I think we can often see people with ME/CFS and other illnesses like that as our teachers, because they have learned some of the lessons that we need in the society more than any other. They've learned some patience. They've learned how to manage with very little time. They've learned how to deal with the chaos of overstimulation with light and sound and things like that, which all of us, in a way, are experiencing in the world today. But they have years and years of experience in handling this. So I think we can see them.
Does Patrick find times of being better than at other times? Are there up days? I mean, sometimes can he go out to dinner with you in a social situation, even if he may collapse afterwards and pay the price?
Just in the last year or so, he's been able to do a little bit of that. Social situations are difficult. If it's one person or a dinner at somebody's house, that's one thing. But to go to a restaurant with all of the chaos and the noise and the waiter and, it gets to be too much. So yes, and usually these outings are, as you said, often followed by a crash. So learning the pacing is, he said to me the other day, I'm terrible at pacing. And I, that's such a key skill to develop. And it's so difficult because with this condition, you never know when you're going over that edge. And of course, the desire, feeling a little better, to go out and maybe do a little something is so great that it's very hard to say. I hate to step in and say, yes, but, I don't want to be a wet blanket. And I think
there are different things that people do. We've discussed them often on these broadcasts. One sufferer who immerses herself in very cold lake water. Other people who, I saw a girl who was bedridden, but she was getting some help from Indians. Rubs, basically spice rubs that she put on her limbs, different therapies. And then, of course, there are therapies that are tried, including Ampligen and other things. Any of these helped, or has he tried any of these, or do you extend any hope or have any information about any of them as applied to Patrick?
Well, he's probably tried just about all of them over the years. Some sort of unusual things that I think have helped have been some of these devices that one of them is a Fisher-Wallace. It's a device you can put on and it provides electrical current. I think we're just at the beginning of understanding ways that can help, because he's used a couple of things like that with some assistance. There have been a couple of new things that have come out, I think largely out of Ron Davis's research, that have Patrick has been able to try, and I think have given him more energy. It's been always, 5% here, 3% there. Each of these things, it's hard to say anything was absolutely dramatic, but I think there is a body of knowledge out there now, and I think there are obviously people who, millions of people who have been trying all these things, and we have some sense of what works. And Patrick's lucky to have a very good medical provider who I think is on top of the general information in the field, and so he has access to the latest ideas.
Then tell us, where do you live?
Because we're in Sedona, Arizona. It's a small town.
Yeah, I know Sedona. I've been there. And you're lucky if you have good medical help. I get a lot of phone calls and emails from people who say, I cannot find a doctor, or I'm on the 12th doctor and he or she doesn't seem to know what's wrong with me, and won't take the time or can't take the time to find out. So you're very fortunate if you are hooked in. You have been active in the community. You were on the CIVIDS board, the old CIVIDS Association, for I think 11 years or something, substantial amount of time. Do you feel that we're making clinical progress towards getting first a biological marker, and secondly, if not a cure, a therapy that will be effective?
Well, I have more hope now than I have had in a long, long time. And I think the influx of long COVID patients has finally started to direct some real serious research in this direction. So I do have hope. Over the years, when I was with the CFS Association, we started out in a way as more a patient support organization until it became clear, what did people need? They needed a cure. They needed treatments. So we began to focus our energy in that direction, and it has paid off with some really, really excellent studies that have come out of that, and some much better understanding. Now, when somebody goes to the research to look, there's a ton of it. There's just a ton. So I'm really encouraged, and I think as a result of that's being a little more social understanding. That's always been very difficult, but I think the fact that there is solid research has made a difference in that regard too.
You're teaching, and you've done many things. You've been a lawyer, you've been an arbitrator, and a teacher, and you teach this special course. You have an association or a foundation. Tell us about that. And did it grow out of your experience with ME?
It did. Oh, it definitely did. At the same time that I was caring for my son, I discovered this integral theory. And Ken Wilber, who is the philosopher behind it, has ME/CFS. He was one of the Lake Tahoe, the Incline Village people. And he's written a book, a beautiful book called Grace and Grit. He married, and 10 days later his wife was diagnosed with advanced breast cancer. So he became both a caregiver, and then during this period that he cared for her, he came down with ME/CFS. So I didn't know this. I was reading the theory, and I got an interview with him, and it turned out he had ME/CFS, and I was just astounded. So I started putting those two together. I asked him how the theory helped him to understand his illness, and I started applying it. And then I started a program at DePaul University called the Chronic Illness Initiative for students with chronic illness, because the people with these kinds of illnesses, it's not the same thing as traditional disabilities. And if a student goes to the disability office, there's very often a lack of understanding. The Chronic Illness Initiative was developed to give students an opportunity to deal with the real accommodations that they needed for their illness. So I did that, and then I started a company with my husband to teach integral theory in a way. And then I realized how much it could apply to chronic illness, and so I started developing around that.
Where can people find out more about that? Do you have a website that they can go to?
Yes, transformationteaching.com is the larger website, and then the koanofillness.com is a site within that. And we have a bunch of interviews. We have some resources on the page. We have a whole bunch of stuff. So please, delighted to have anybody join. And we offer several things during the year, discussion groups. I'm doing a book group right now, that sort of thing. So if people want to join in, there are many ways to do that.
Can you, in the last few minutes, very briefly explain to us the theory of integration?
Well, I spent 25 years learning it, so it's a little difficult. But it's a theory of everything. It's a theory of wholeness. It's a theory of evolution and systems, so that when you're looking at a problem like illness, you take in everything. One of the simple models is what I call the 4 quadrants, where anything that happens to us happens to our interior. Oh, I've gotten sick. Oh my gosh, how do I feel? It happens to our exterior, our body. What's going wrong with my body? What's happening in my environment? Our relationships are affected. So who am I now at work, with my spouse, with people like that? And then the other quadrant is the systems quadrant. How do I deal with all of these systems I have to deal with? All 4 of those areas are so important, and very often people focus on only one. There's a focus now with the new age in the upper left, which attempts to psychologize all illness. There's the traditional conventional medicine, which is all about if you can't find a test for it, it doesn't exist. So we have these different worldviews, these different silos of understanding about illness, but there are very few people who look at them all and realize that they're all important. So that's just a small taste of the theory and how I think it's so helpful in the way that we look at illness and we look at people who have illness.
Thank you very much indeed. You're a very interesting woman, and it's been an honor and a pleasure. I hope that Patrick returns to full health at some time, as we hope for all the people who suffer from this truly ghastly affliction. Then thank you, and please come back.
Thank you, Llewellyn, and thank you for doing this. It's so good of you to highlight this terrible condition for all of us.
That's our broadcast for today. Thank you to the viewers for joining us. Until next time, I wish you really the best of luck and, if possible, health. Cheers.